the loneliness behind intelligence. You walk into a room and instantly feel like a guest in a play you didn't audition for. Everyone's talking, laughing, exchanging words that sound warm but feel thin. You try to join and smile at the right times, nod when you're supposed to, but part of you is already drifting away. It's not because you don't care. You do. Maybe too much. But the conversation feels like a surface you can't sink into. You notice how people avoid silence, how they flatter each other without meaning it, how the energy changes when someone honest speaks. And suddenly, your brain switches on. You're no longer present. You're decoding tone, posture, subtext. You catch the eye roll masked by a smile, the forced laugh, the conversation that ends just before anything real begins. And once again, you feel like you're not really in the room. You're studying it. If you're someone who feels the world more than most, who notices the gap between words and truth, then you've probably asked yourself, why does it feel so hard to truly connect? Why does being smart, being aware, sometimes make you feel more alone? It's not arrogance. It's clarity. You see the scripts others follow. You sense when something's off. And because of that, surface-level bonding feels exhausting. Pretending to connect feels lonelier than being alone. So, over time, you stop trying. You keep things polite, predictable, safe. But deep down, you ache for someone who gets it. Someone who doesn't need you to shrink to feel comfortable. This video is for people like you. Because the truth is, intelligence doesn't just help you solve problems. It changes how you relate to people. And sometimes, it builds walls no one else even sees. But those walls aren't permanent. And in the next few chapters, we'll explore how deep minds can find deep connections without pretending to be shallow. Let's begin. Seeing through people ruins comfort. Most people can meet someone new and take things at face value. They can enjoy the moment, believe what's said, smile without questioning the motive behind the words. But for highly intelligent people, this kind of comfort is rare. Not because they don't want to trust, but because their mind doesn't let them. When you're wired to notice patterns, you pick up on things others miss. The delayed pause before a compliment. The overly rehearsed praise. The faint bitterness in someone's eyes when you mention your success. You sense undercurrents others ignore. You hear the tone behind the words. You feel the tension behind the laughter. And you don't do this because you're looking for drama. You do it because you can't help it. Your brain is a scanner. It's always on, always listening for truth beneath performance. And that makes simple connection difficult. Because relationships, especially new ones, are built on a kind of polite illusion. On temporary assumptions of goodwill. On mutual unawareness. But you're not unaware. And that makes people uncomfortable. They feel seen before they're ready. They feel read without giving you permission. They sense that you're not just listening, you're understanding. And understanding can feel threatening when someone isn't being authentic. Even if you're kind, even if you're silent, your clarity creates pressure. So what happens? People start pulling away. Not in dramatic ways. Just little shifts. They share less. They laugh more nervously. They start calling you intense, or distant, or too analytical. And slowly, without ever naming it, they make it clear, I can't be myself around you not because of you, but because of how you make me feel. You didn't criticize them. You didn't demand truth. But your presence challenged their mask. And so, instead of closeness, you get withdrawal. Instead of trust, you get tension. Eventually, you start wondering, is something wrong with me? Do I expect too much? Should I lower my sensitivity, mute my perception, fake being less aware? But here's the truth, no. You're not wrong. You're just awake in a world that often prefers to sleep. And while that might isolate you now, it also means that when connection finally happens, it will be real. And rare. And worth the wait. They don't enjoy small talk or surface bonding. There's a certain kind of conversation that fills time but leaves the soul untouched. the kind that revolves around weather, weekend plans, or what someone ate for lunch. Most people find comfort in that. It's easy, predictable, safe. But for someone with a deeply intelligent and curious mind, these exchanges often feel like noise. Small talk isn't just boring, it's exhausting. Not because smart people think they're above it, but because they crave depth. They want to know what keeps you up at night, what you're afraid to say out loud, what you believe about life, about death, about the meaning hiding behind ordinary moments. That's not arrogance. That's hunger for something real. And that's where the disconnect happens. In most social settings, depth is discouraged. Vulnerability is inconvenient. The moment you bring up something real pain, purpose, the paradoxes of human nature, you're met with polite nods or awkward silence. People change the subject. Or worse, they label you too intense or trying too hard. So what do smart people do? They pull back. They learn to smile and keep it light. To talk about TV shows and headlines. To participate in conversations they don't care about just to avoid alienating others. But inside, they're restless, lonely, starving for someone who will go further. This creates a painful loop. They long for connection, but connection doesn't come without risk. And too often, when they've dared to go deep, they've been met with discomfort, even rejection. So now, they hide. Not because they have nothing to say, but because what they want to say feels too much for the room they're in. And that hiding becomes habit. They become the person who listens more than they speak, the one who nods but rarely shares, the one who seems mysterious but is really just tired of being misunderstood. But here's the irony: deep thinkers don't need many connections. They only need a few, but those few must be real. And in a world addicted to stimulation and surface, that kind of connection is rare. Still, they wait. And while they wait, they feel more and more like an outsider in rooms that were never built for them. Because the truth is, when your mind is wired for depth, surface-level bonding doesn't just feel empty, it feels like betrayal of your time, your truth, and your need to feel understood. Overthinking destroys emotional spontaneity. One of the most beautiful parts of human connection is spontaneity, the unfiltered laugh, the awkward silence that turns into something intimate, the moments that aren't planned or polished. But for people with highly analytical minds, that kind of spontaneity is hard to access. Not because they're emotionally cold, but because their brain never stops calculating. They're always scanning. What did that tone mean? Was that joke really a joke? Should I have said that differently? Did they hesitate before answering? Were they being honest or just polite? These questions don't come after the conversation. They happen during, in real time, and they create a kind of emotional interference. A second layer of thought that sits between the moment and the feeling. So even when something feels good, when there's laughter, closeness, warmth, it's being filtered, analyzed, broken down. This overthinking isn't intentional. It's a habit formed over years of pattern recognition, of reading between the lines, of surviving environments where what was said didn't always match what was meant. It's a form of emotional self-defense. And while it can be useful in avoiding harm, it also prevents joy. Because real connection requires a degree of surrender. It asks us to be in the moment, not above it. To trust even when we're uncertain. To let go of needing to know everything in order to feel something. But for the intelligent overthinker, that's terrifying. They'd rather hold back than misstep. They'd rather stay quiet than risk saying something that reveals too much. And so, moments that could have become memories instead become missed opportunities, overanalyzed, second-guessed, lost to mental noise. This creates distance. Not because they're pushing people away, but because they're too caught up in internal checks to fully show up. They seem calm, in control, composed, but beneath that is often a storm of questions, doubts, and unspoken feelings. And that storm isn't visible. It's quiet. It looks like a half smile instead of a laugh. A thoughtful pause instead of a spontaneous hug. A gentle nod instead of a vulnerable confession. To the outside world, they appear reserved, maybe even distant. But the truth is, They're simply stuck between the need to feel and the need to make sense of everything they feel. And until they learn to quiet that second voice, the one narrating, questioning, dissecting, they'll struggle to experience the raw, imperfect, beautiful chaos that real connection is built on. They've been used as emotional support for others. For many intelligent people, the earliest form of connection wasn't mutual. It was service. They weren't loved for who they were, but for what they could provide: insight, comfort, perspective, emotional labor. Somewhere along the way, their role in relationships became less about being seen and more about being useful. They became the therapist's friend, the listener, the one who always had the right words when others were lost, the one who understood, who forgave, who made room for everyone's chaos but never asked for anything in return. And people loved them for it until the moment they needed support themselves. That's when the silence came. When the intelligent person finally cracked, showed weakness, expressed confusion, or need, many of those around them disappeared. Not out of cruelty, but out of discomfort. Because the world had grown accustomed to their strength, their insight, their ability to hold space for others. But no one was prepared to hold space for them. This creates a deep fracture in trust. They start to believe that love is conditional. That connection only exists when they're useful. That the moment they need something, they become a burden. And so, they stop asking. They stop sharing. They carry more than they should because they fear what happens when they don't. Over time, this turns into emotional isolation. They're surrounded by people, yet feel profoundly alone. They give advice, offer help, show up, but their own inner world remains untouched. No one asks. No one thinks to. And even when someone does, they often downplay it. "I'm fine," they say. It's nothing. But it is something. It's the aching weight of being strong for too long. Of being wise beyond their years while still craving the simple permission to fall apart. And when that permission never comes, they retreat not out of bitterness, but out of quiet exhaustion. They begin to see relationships as one-sided, even transactional. And unless someone otherwise proves that they can stay when the mask slips, they'd rather not try. Because being needed is not the same as being loved. Being admired is not the same as being held. And until they experience the kind of connection that allows them to be both strong and soft, both capable and vulnerable, they will continue to mistake emotional labor for intimacy. They expect too much depth too soon. Smart people don't just crave connection, they crave meaning. While others may enjoy light banter and casual company, it wants to know what someone believes, what they fear, what they dream about at 2 a.m. The deeper the thought, the more alive they feel. But that hunger for depth comes with a hidden cost. Because most relationships aren't built in the deep end. They start in the shallow, in curiosity, in slowly learning someone's edges before diving into their center. But intelligent people often skip that part. Not because they're impatient, but because they've already lived so far inward that anything less feels like pretending. They ask questions others aren't ready to answer. They share truths that feel too raw for strangers. They show up with openness that's beautiful. And intensity, when met too early, can feel like pressure. What was meant as connection becomes confrontation. The other person may feel overwhelmed, even if they don't say it. They might back away, not because they're shallow, but because the pace is unfamiliar. Vulnerability is a language, and not everyone speaks it fluently, especially at first. But the intelligent person doesn't always see this. They take the withdrawal personally. They feel rejected not just by the individual, but by the world that never seems ready for what they have to give. And so they internalize a story that no one wants what's real. That people only want the polished version, the light version, the version that doesn't ask too many questions. So, over time, they begin to edit themselves. Or worse, they isolate entirely. What started as a search for truth becomes a pattern of retreat. And yet, the truth remains. Their depth isn't the problem. Their speed is. Depth takes time to be received. It needs space to grow. It requires trust, context, and a shared rhythm. And just because someone isn't ready on day one doesn't mean they'll never be. So instead of assuming they're too much, the intelligent person must learn to pace themselves to lead with warmth, not intensity. To open the door without demanding someone walk through it immediately. Because true connection isn't about how fast you go, it's about how real you're willing to be when the time is right. They're hypersensitive to rejection or hypocrisy. Highly intelligent people don't just process information, they feel patterns. They absorb subtle shifts in tone, micro-expressions, pauses that last half a second too long. And because of this heightened awareness, they don't need someone to say they've been rejected. They feel it in the air before the words ever arrive. This sensitivity can be a gift. It allows them to read the emotional climate with precision. But it's also a curse, because even the smallest signs of dismissal or disapproval hit them harder than most. A delayed text, a vague response, a moment of being left out of a conversation. What others might shrug off, they internalize. Not because they're weak, but because their inner world is always listening. And rejection isn't the only wound, they're also highly allergic to hypocrisy. When someone claims to care but acts indifferent. When they say one thing and do another. When they pretend to value honesty but punish it the moment it shows up. These contradictions cut deep. Not because they're unfamiliar, but because the intelligent person sees the lie and feels the betrayal simultaneously. They begin to distrust not just individuals, but the idea of connection itself. They tell themselves it's safer not to expect consistency, not to hope. Because every time they believe in someone's words more than their actions, they get hurt. And this creates a feedback loop. The more they feel disappointed, the more they withdraw. The more they withdraw, the lonelier they become. But instead of reaching out, they sharpen their awareness, trying to predict the next letdown before it happened. This hypervigilance makes connection nearly impossible. Not because they don't want it, but because they're trying to protect something very fragile, their trust. And trust, once broken, doesn't heal with apologies. It heals with presence, with actions that match words, with time that proves consistency. But few people have the patience or the emotional integrity to offer that. So the intelligent person often finds themselves stuck, wanting connection, fearing rejection, craving truth, but expecting hypocrisy. And unless someone proves them wrong with sustained honesty, they assume the cycle will repeat. This isn't bitterness. It's survival. Because when you've been cut by empty promises, even kindness can feel like a setup. And until you meet someone whose depth matches your sensitivity, you'll keep guarding yourself from pain, even if it means guarding yourself from love. How to find genuine connection without shrinking yourself. So how does someone who feels too much, thinks too deeply, and sees too clearly find love, friendship, and connection without having to dilute who they are? The answer isn't to become someone else. It's to stop searching for quantity and start honoring quality. Because for the intelligent, emotionally aware person, one genuine connection will always be more fulfilling than 100 surface-level ones. But that kind of connection doesn't come from effort alone. It comes from alignment. Start by choosing environments where depth is not punished but welcomed. Where asking real questions isn't seen as rude, but as refreshing. This might mean fewer people, but better people. People who don't flinch when you speak your truth. Who don't mistake your silence for judgment. Who understand that still waters run deep and are willing to swim there with you. You don't have to open up to everyone. In fact, you shouldn't. But you do need to stop assuming that no one is capable of meeting you at your level. That assumption, while protective, becomes a prison. The truth is, there are people out there who are just as sensitive, just as thoughtful, just as tired of pretending as you are. But they're hiding too, waiting for someone like you to show them it's safe to come out. And that someone doesn't need to be perfect, just honest, grounded, willing to go slow and deep instead of fast and shallow. Start small. Show up where the real conversations happen. Say what you mean, even if your voice shakes. Ask a question that goes beneath the surface and wait. Let silence do its work. If the person isn't ready, that's okay. But when someone leans in instead of backing away, you'll know. You'll know you're not alone anymore. Because real connection doesn't require you to shrink. It asks you to stand exactly as you are and trust that the right people will recognize the shape of your soul. And when they do, everything changes. You stop apologizing for your depth, you stop fearing your sensitivity, and you finally begin to understand your mind was never the problem. It was your compass, waiting for the world to catch up. Loneliness becomes a safe place. At some point, after enough failed connections, enough misunderstood intentions, enough moments of giving their full self and being met with silence, something shifts inside the intelligent person. Loneliness, which once felt unbearable, now feels safer. It becomes familiar, predictable, and most of all, controlled. When you're alone, there are no mixed signals, no forced small talk, no pretending to be okay when you're not. You can breathe. You can think. You can be fully yourself without the constant fear of being too much, too deep, too different. And so, solitude stops being a temporary state. It becomes a refuge. They convince themselves they don't need anyone. That independence is peace. That emotional detachment is wisdom. And in some ways, that's true. Solitude can be healing. It gives space for reflection, creativity, and clarity. But when it turns into isolation, it doesn't just protect you from harm, it shields you from joy. Because the same walls that keep out disappointment also keep out warmth. They start declining invitations. Not because they're arrogant, but because the effort rarely feels worth it. They stop initiating conversations, not out of pride, but from fatigue. Emotional fatigue. The kind that says, I've tried to be seen, and I wasn't. I've tried to belong, and I didn't. So maybe this is just easier. But easier doesn't mean better. Over time, that self-protection becomes self-sabotage. The loneliness they once chose for safety begins to echo. It no longer feels empowering. It feels hollow. And in the quiet, they start to wonder, what if I close myself off too tightly? What if, in avoiding pain, I also shut out possibility? Because even the most independent soul still longs for resonance, for a voice that says, I see you. You're not too much. You never were. But to hear that voice, they have to take a risk again. To open a door they've learned to keep locked. To trust not blindly, but bravely. Because while loneliness may be safe, it's not love. And love, in its truest form, can't find you unless you leave the safety of silence and step back into the world, one honest moment at a time.